Northeast Asia is one of the most complex, fragile regions in the global security landscape. What are the reasons for this? How can the Northeast Asia security dilemma be solved? During Kim Jong-un's visit to China, the two sides discussed the issue of denuclearization as well as bilateral ties. What role will China play in the future of the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue? 2018 marks the 40th anniversary of the China-Japan Treaty of Peace and Friendship. Can China and Japan make a breakthrough in diplomatic ties?
Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi on Tuesday met with the Foreign Minister of the DPRK, Mr. Yong in Beijing. During their meeting, Wang Yi said that China supports the summit between the DPRK and the Republic of Korea, as well as the one between the DPRK and the United States. What might be the future of the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue, and how should we view the Northeast Asia security dilemma? To discuss these issues and more, today I'm very pleased to be joined in the Beijing studio by Mr. Gregory Kalaki, a senior analyst at the Union of Concerned Scientists, and Mr. Zhao Tong, a fellow at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to Dialogue, Gregory. We're talking about who was the first in the pecking order to issue the invitation that brought about the official visit of Mr. Kim Jong-un, who came to Beijing, and everybody was very happy here in the capital city. But what's your hunch about what's behind?
Well, it's hard to know who invited who. But I think this whole initiative started with the South Korean government and President Moon, who wanted to use the Olympics and this occasion to sort of cool things down on the peninsula and start a diplomatic initiative. So if we're going to thank anybody for making all this happen, I think he deserves the lion's share of the credit.
And Dalton, what do you think of the catalyst or driving force behind this latest round of the peace process in the Korean Peninsula?
Yeah, I think it's North Korea that probably made the first move to come to China. So that shows that it's North Korea that played the most important role behind this most recent diplomatic overture. I think North Korea, after achieving a basic nuclear deterrent, is now ready to move into the next phase, in which it will seek to improve relations within the region and hopefully to make the international community accept the nuclear reality.
We're going to have three. In fact, we have had one summit meeting between Kim Jong-un and his Chinese counterpart, Mr. Xi Jinping. Now, what about the next two summit meetings? Which one will be a decisive force in shaping the future of the Korean Peninsula? Do you think President Trump will take the lead?
Well, it'll be a very important meeting. But I think the concern in the arms control community, at least in the United States, is that if the meeting is not successful, if there's no agreement, if the two men meet, then that will be a pretext for renewed talk about military action on the peninsula.
What do you think of the importance of imposing maximum pressure? And the Japanese government has been a die-hard fan of this maximum pressure. And the State Department of the U.S. government said proudly, look, the official meeting between Mr. Kim and Mr. Xi was none other than the culmination of such a maximum pressure. Do you agree?
Well, I think it's true that with new senior U.S. officials like John Bolton and Pompeo in the White House, people are concerned that in case the summit meeting failed, and in fact these people, they would love to see the summit meeting fails, so they would have a good excuse to resort to the military option. I think that's precisely why North Korea chose to come to Beijing first, because that offers North Korea an insurance policy against a possible failure of the North-U.S. summit. In case the summit fails and people like Pompeo and Bolton want to use a military option or continue the maximum pressure campaign, without Chinese support, without Russian support, without South Korean consent, I don't see how they can use the military option. And without Chinese full cooperation, I don't see how they can have another UN Security Council resolution to impose tougher sanctions against North Korea.
But do you think China is likely, Gregory, do you think China is likely to write a blank check for the DPRK government? Despite the glow of official rhetoric during Mr. Kim Jong-un's visit, talking about the party-to-party relationship, as if we've been brought back to the Cold War, when the ideology was the hallmark about the official ties between the founding father of the DPRK and the late Chairman Mao Zedong?
Well, I think China's probably just as concerned about nuclear weapons in North Korea as the United States is. So I don't think it'll give it a blank check. But I think China's priority has always been stability on the peninsula, and that first and foremost means avoiding war. It also means avoiding debilitating sanctions that lead to political unrest inside of North Korea. So I think China is definitely going to give North Korea a little more latitude than the other international players in the region.
We have different shades of stability. When you address the issue of destabilizing situation in Northeast Asia, one is, of course, economic sanctions that may lead to the anxiety of the regime. The other is war games on our doorsteps. And the highest escalation of the tensions would be, of course, outbreak of hostilities under the U.S. leadership. China, it seems there is a limit to China can do. For example, with the UN-led economic sanctions against the DPRK still in effect, China wouldn't easily lift the sanctions that the DPRK has been so concerned with. We cannot do anything serious. No major moves yet to be taken by the Chinese side at this moment. What do you think of the Chinese concerns?
I agree. I don't think there is a lot of room for China to be flexible about its implementation of the UN Security Council resolutions. China signed down to those resolutions, and therefore China has a legal obligation to completely and fully carry out the implementation. I think there is a concern that over time, North Korea might come up with clever ways to circumvent the sanctions, to evade those restrictions. We heard some news that North Korea is now selling more electricity to other countries and therefore getting some foreign income. Those has now been banned by the UN Security Council. But if no new resolution are imposed, North Korea over time may be increasingly capable of coming up new ways to get money from outside.
So what's going to happen next?
Well, I don't think that economic sanctions are the reason Kim's coming to the table now. I think, based on what we've learned from people who participated in Track 2 talks, I was recently in Tokyo and received a briefing. Sanctions aren't really having, other than higher gas prices, on North Korea's economy at the moment. As a matter of fact, cutting off seafood exports just meant that locals had more to eat. And cutting off coal exports just meant that locals' houses were a little warmer last winter than they were the winter before. It'll take a long time for sanctions to have effect. So I think maybe it's smart of Kim to move now before the economy is really in any difficulty, so that he has some time for protracted negotiations with all the parties involved.
With the UN mandate economic sanctions still in place, what would be the deliverables, if any, between the DPRK leader and Mr. Moon Jae-in, president of the ROK? For example, what do you think of the options of reopening the Kaohsiung Industrial Park? What about family reunions? More exchange of artists and performers? Taekwondo, for example, the flexing muscles. What do you think?
I think the summit between the North and South Koreas are likely to focus more on inter-Korean relationship rather than on the nuclear issue. There are many things they can do to improve the inter-Korean relationship. In fact, according to a most recent statement from the Blue House senior official, he said there are three priorities for this meeting. One is to improve inter-Korean relationship. And in this regard, they can resume the family reunions. They can set up high-level hotlines. In fact, they are talking about setting up a direct hotline between Kim Jong-un and Moon Jae-in. They can explore with possibilities of economic cooperation, although reopening of the Kaohsiung Industrial Park, I think, is difficult to do given existing sanctions. The second priority is to achieve permanent peace on the Korean Peninsula, to quote this Blue House official. What that means, I guess, is maybe some efforts to explore a possible security regime on the peninsula, maybe also efforts to reduce conventional military deployments across the border. But third priority is to address the nuclear issue. On that one, I think Blue House might try to achieve two aspects, a two-element strategy. One is to have a broad political commitment to the goal of denuclearization in the long run. So they are working to achieve a joint declaration on that goal. But second, they want to make sure this process is a phased process, starting with near-term steps, such as freezing North Korea capability. I think that could set the table for how the upcoming North and USA meeting would look like.
Gregory, do you see growing discrepancies, schisms, divisions between the U.S. and ROK on the prospects of the peace process in the Korean Peninsula? Because Moon Jae-in vows never ever a single bullet should be fired on the territory of the Korean Peninsula without his permission. He is in every bit of the sense to be a pacifist. He doesn't want to be viewed as a perpetrator of any wars against the people of the two Koreas. So what do you think of the adversity of the current situation? Without the permission from Washington, do you think there should be any serious moves in the correct direction?
Well, I think what South Korea is trying to do is to calm things down, to take the edge off all of these threats of military action that are coming from the United States. It seems clear to me that there is a large disagreement between the government of the Republic of Korea and the United States over how to resolve the problem. They do not want to see any sort of increased military pressure that could lead to an accidental start of conflict, whereas the United States wants to hold out the threat and make that threat as credible as they possibly can, to the point where you have people like Lindsey Graham of South Carolina talking about removing U.S. dependence from South Korea. And I believe that in the current war games, they're actually doing an exercise where they prepare to withdraw U.S. dependence from South Korea as a way of signaling that the United States is really prepared for military conflict.
Or unilateral and preemptive strike.
And
that's very dangerous. Do you think this is a result of the installation of John Bolton in the White House as the senior advisor? I mean, this is nuts. Do you think?
I don't think in the Trump administration being an advisor really means anything.
Ooh.
He's changed people so often.
These guys, like Gregory, are pouring scorns on the use of John Bolton. He would be infuriated, you know.
Well, you know, I've never met Mr. Bolton, and I guess he could be mad at me if he likes. But people come and go in the Trump administration, and the only person's opinion who seems to really matter is the president's, and he changes it quite often. Often he'll say one thing in a public setting that contradicts something that one of the major officers in his government said an hour or 2 hours earlier. So I wouldn't overestimate the influence of advisors on the decisions of the president. He seems to want to make these decisions on his own.
Perhaps we have overestimated the importance of the presidency in the Oval Office. Perhaps with regard to the China policy, as an example, Zhao Tong, it seems the two parties across the aisle, Republicans and Democrats, have been able to build a consensus about whether they should terminate or phase out the policy of engagement with the PRC. They wouldn't use the phrase of a maximum pressure against China to wring concessions from our country on the trade war or the trade bluff. So another major party in the current game concerning the future of the Northeast Asian volatility is China, of course. And looking behind this, no one would easily solve the issue of denuclearization without the serious participation of the PRC. So what do you think of the bipartisan consensus against engagement with China? And do you think this threatens to bring about more uncertainty in the region?
I think China shares a similar interest with South Korea, as Gregory mentioned, which is to prevent war as a top priority. So with this recent North Korea-China summit meeting, I think China also plays the role of making sure the U.S. wouldn't resort to the military option regardless of the result of the upcoming summit meeting. So now China tries to keep both players at the table, both North Korea and United States at the table for as long as possible. I think in this process, China can offer a number of things. It can offer Beijing as a potential summit meeting place. I think that possibility has increased after this visit by Kim Jong-un and also the visit of North Korean Foreign Minister Wang Yi recently. China can also offer what can be done next after the bilateral summit between North Korea and the United States. There was a recent proposal that maybe we should broaden the bilateral meetings to four-party meetings to also include South Korea and China at the negotiating table. And if the results are positive, maybe then we can broaden the discussions to a six-party talks. I think China has its own experience of dealing with North Korea and understanding North Korean political ideology and knows better than countries like the United States about how North Korean leaders think. So China has a unique role and increasing leverage to play.
Thank you so much. Despite our official statements that say clearly we would not allow for any instability or chaos in our neighboring country, the DPRK, China has not clearly provided Pyongyang with the security assurance that they are so hungry with. Neither has the United States government made any serious commitments to the security assurance. That's the only thing that may prevent an outbreak of hostilities. But you are watching Dialogue with Dr. Zhao Tong and Mr. Gregory Kalaki. We are discussing the prospects of Northeast Asia. When we come back, we'll take a look at Russia, which has been isolated by yet another round of sanctions and expulsions of diplomats. We'll see what's going to happen next. So stay with us, please. Uncertainty of Northeast Asia is a major issue, of course, but what about Russia? Is yet another major party, at least it's one of the players in the six-party talks which came to a halt for one reason or another. Russia may be forced to get closer to the People's Republic of China, and second tracks in Tokyo showed clearly Russia, China, Vietnam, and some of the neighboring countries have indeed converged to discuss issues of common concern or agenda that they can share. So what do you think of the role that Russia can play in the foreseeable future? Gregory.
Well, there was some talk at recent events I attended in Tokyo of scholars and government officials that Kim's next summit is going to be with Putin. It may happen before he meets with the South Korean president. It may happen.
Despite the very strong opposition from Democrats, Republicans, the establishment, and elites, media campaigns in the United States, he's going to go ahead and meet with Putin. This is nuts. This is absolutely ridiculous for outside observers.
Well, this was the talk in Tokyo, that Kim's next move would be to reach out to Putin and have a summit with him. So he will have met with, he's going to be meeting with the president of South Korea, the United States, China, and Russia. It's a smart move, I think, on his part if he were to decide to make that outreach. It would put Russia as a player at the table as well.
Right. Do you think it's a good idea for Mr. Putin to provide the venue and the location for the summit meeting? For example, Moscow or St. Petersburg for Mr. Kim and Mr. Donald Trump?
I think Putin...
in that way, I mean, yeah. Putin and Donald Trump can meet on the sidelines of the meeting, and, you know, they talk about the denuclearization.
Exactly. I think Putin would love to offer Russia as a potential summit meeting place. President Trump just said he reportedly invited Putin to come to D.C., and that has caused a lot of domestic backlash in Washington. So if he hosts the summit between Kim and Trump and also meets with Trump in Russia, that would appear at least less provocative to many Washington watchers. But I doubt Kim Jong-un now has the time to travel all the way to Russia. If he avoids flying, he has to take the train. That's a multiple trip one way to Moscow, and before, you know, the summit with South Korean president is only 3 weeks.
That's right.
So that would, you know, he would have a very tight schedule to make all the way to Moscow. But I think even if President Trump wants to meet in Russia, his advisors, the general public in the United States, would strongly advise against him doing so at this particular moment. In fact, I think the U.S. has a lot of concern of Russia now playing the role to sabotage the international coalition to maintain the maximum pressure on North Korea. There were reports that North Korean ships continue to visit some Russian ports and unload the North Korean coal and then reload to pretend the coal is from Russia rather than North Korea. So that provides North Korea a way to escape the sanction regime. So I'm not very hopeful that Russia may be the place.
What about the closer relationship between Moscow and Beijing? For example, the latest dramatic development says Russians will join hands with China to have a merge between their two independent navigation systems. The Kolonas and the Beidou system should be emerged and combined together to form an independent competitor against the GPS. I mean, this is a very powerful message, I believe, after China is being transformed into a strategic competitor. China has no other options without going to Russia. I mean, this seems to be a prelude to yet another Cold War. Gregory.
Well, on the GPS matter, I mean, there's always been discussion about making the Chinese system interchangeable, both the U.S. system and the Russian system and the system that Europe's building. So I don't really see that as a major technological or strategic change. And China's system itself will be quite robust when it's finally finished. In terms of Russia and China, I think China has an interest, at least it says it has an interest, in maintaining the existing global order. And I think Russia's proven itself to be a disruptive force in the current global order. So I think there's some differences between Russia and China on how to manage affairs in the international system right now. So I don't think their interests are entirely
But the issue, by the end of the day, I'm afraid, is Washington needs to figure out how to position China in its foreign policy. Should it be viewed as a potentially geopolitical rival? Because they do believe China wants to rebuild the world order and to challenge the primacy of the U.S. leadership, be it in the digital technology domain or geopolitically in general. So we're talking about the haunting specter that yet another round of Cold War is to happen, and China will be pushed to the Russian side. Don't forget, ahead of the Cold War, Richard Nixon came over to China, which was a third independent party geopolitically, and of course, Ronald Reagan beat the Soviet Union and won the Cold War. But what about the role China played throughout the whole process? If China is to be pushed way over to Russians, then do you think what about the balance?
I think I very much share your concern. I think the West is really driving Russia and China together to a much closer bilateral relationship. You know, we spend a lot of time talking about North Korea, but I think very few Americans really concerned about North Korea suddenly launching a nuclear weapon towards the United States. But they are very concerned about the present threat from Russia interfering in American political elections, threatening the Baltic allies of the NATO countries. So Russia is an immediate major threat, and they also, the U.S. defines China as the long-term rival. So they put Russia and China increasingly in the same category of major long-term threats. And on the ground, we do see the consequences, which is Russia and China are indeed cooperating more closely on a range of military security foreign policy issues. We see they have missile defense cooperation. They already conducted a number of joint missile defense simulation exercises. Russia is willing to sell China some of its most advanced anti-missile systems like the S-400 interceptors. Both countries are also jointly organizing military drills in many parts of the world, Mediterranean, Eastern China Sea, etc. So the degree of military security cooperation is indeed increasing. And another fact in the Northeast Asia region is, in the future, North Korea is likely to keep some nuclear weapons for the foreseeable future, which means U.S. and its allies, South Korea, Japan, will continue deploying more advanced military assets in the region. And those would for sure be seen by Russia and China as threats towards themselves. So I think we will see closer cooperation in the future. And now North Korean leader is visiting China and Russia. It looks like North Korea is coming back to this traditional Cold War framework of China, Russia, North Korea on one side, and U.S. and its allies on the other side. So I do share a concern. This Cold War security structure is emerging in certain areas, and we do need very strong multilateral security dialogue mechanism to penetrate this divide and making sure we don't fall into those Cold War tragedies again.
Outside the security scenario of denuclearization in Northeast Asia lies yet another giant, India, which is being neutralized by very intensive diplomatic campaigns between the two governments. Taking the SCO summit in Qingdao in June as an example, Prime Minister Modi will have a summit meeting with his Chinese counterpart, but we'll wait to see what will happen. Also next time. Goodbye.